Yes, what's going on everyone? Welcome back to GEA Fan TV. I hope you're all doing well during these quarantine times. Yeah, of course, back again with another video for this channel. If you are new around here, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, all that stuff. And yeah, you know what? Obviously, there's been a lot of talk in the past couple of weeks during this lockdown of some memorable GEA games. You know, you're looking back at some of the big All-Ireland wins in both football and hurling, and of course, you know, for myself as a Dublin fan, it's been great, you know, looking back on some of those great days in the past decade, those 7 All-Ireland victories. They've been great, I'm not gonna lie, it's been brilliant, but a lot of time we forget about the bad days with Dublin. There were some awful days as a Dublin fan, especially in the decade previous. You know, the years between 2000 and 2010, I remember going to a lot of those games and just coming out of them literally wanting the ground to swallow me up. I mean, it was awful at times. And, you know, I actually look back at some of them games and I think many of those matches actually helped Dublin in becoming the team that they are today. You know, you look back at some of those defeats against Kerry, Meath, you know, some of the other kind of overwhelming defeats. I think they actually helped grind Dublin into the side that they are today. And, you know, a lot of times in life, you need to taste a big degree of failure before you can have success. And at the time, it certainly didn't feel that way. I mean, some of these results were just embarrassing and awful, but nonetheless, they were what in many ways led Dublin to the team they were today. However, what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to be looking at 5 times that Dublin were absolutely humiliated in Gaelic football. I'm not too sure why I'm doing this, but sure, look, listen, it's quarantine. I mean, there's just really nothing to do. And yeah, I mean, for everyone that's watching that are Kerry fans, Mayo fans, enjoy. These were some awful matches, I'm not gonna lie. All right, so we start off with the 5th most embarrassing defeat from Dublin, in my opinion. And it is worth pointing out that a lot of these games, well, all of these games are from like 2000 onwards. I didn't really look at matches before then. I feel like Gaelic football was a lot more competitive back then. And I feel like a lot of Dublin's embarrassing defeats have especially come, you know, since 2000 onwards. So just bear that in mind. And first of all, obviously, we look at the Dublin versus Mayo game in 2006. I mean, there were a couple of other games I could have thrown in here. I think the other 4 embarrassing games I'm going to talk about kind of trump this massively. In many ways, this was an embarrassing defeat for Dublin because they came into this game as almost favourites for the All-Ireland in many ways. I mean, Kerry, of course, we're already in the All-Ireland final, having beaten Cork. Dublin came into this game, you know, ready to now win an All-Ireland. You know, they'd won the Leinster Championship in 2005, won the Leinster Championship again in 2006. They had a lot of players that were now starting to come into their prime. Alan Brogan, for example, Mossy Quinn, Conal Keeney. And he had a Dublin side that was, you know, Kieran Whelan, for example, as well. You had a Dublin side that was now, in many ways, built towards winning an All-Ireland. And in this particular year, Tyrone had let themselves down. They had been knocked out of the All-Ireland Championship. And this was it for Dublin. They were coming up against a Mayo side that, you know, had, of course, played in the All-Ireland final in 2004. But I think everyone just underestimated this Mayo side. And I think a lot of people thought that that Mayo team were just lucky to get into that 2004 final because they had played Fermanagh, for example, in that year's semi-final. So I suppose you'll start off with the Hillgate saga that took place at the start of this game. Now, this was where all of the Mayo players actually trained in front of Hill 16 at the start of the game. Now, normally this doesn't happen in Gaelic football when Dublin are playing in Croke Park. Normally what will happen is Dublin will be the side that will train in front of Hill 16. It's kind of like a tradition with Dublin football. I don't think anyone's ever really talked much about this before in terms of it being a tradition for Dublin football to play in front of Hill 16. But because Mayo just decided to do this, it sort of became a big saga. And what actually happened was, obviously, the Mayo team were training, they were getting their warm-ups in, and this definitely flustered Dublin because they didn't come out, they took their time coming out of the changing room. They seemed to wait like 3 or 4 to 5 minutes to see if Mayo would maybe then move towards the other end. And then when Dublin did come onto the pitch, there definitely was a lot of confusion amongst the Dublin players. They did go and train down the Hill 16 end again, or Hill 16 end along with Mayo, but they were definitely flustered. They didn't get a proper warm-up in, and it did rile Dublin up. I think the evidence of Paul Caffrey, for example, going and I think shoulder barging Mickey Moran, the Mayo manager at the time, just showed how much this got under Dublin's skin. And it definitely riled Dublin up, and they didn't get a proper warm-up in. But in many ways, like, fair play to Mayo. Like Mickey Moore inside, they had the psychological battle won in those early stages. And I actually think if this happened today, for example, or if this had happened in the Jim Gavin or even the Pat Gilroy era, I don't think Dublin would have bought into this. I think they would have trained down the other end. Just get your proper warm-up in, do your talking on the pitch, and then you can talk about everything else that happened after. And yeah, I think that actually took its toll on Dublin in this game as well, because in the opening 20 minutes, Dublin just could not get going. I mean, Mayo probably weren't at their absolute best in the opening 20 minutes either, but it took Dublin 17 minutes to actually register their first point, and there was a lot of uncharacteristic play from Dublin in this game. Mossy Quinn was missing a lot of easy frees. Dublin couldn't really get Jason Sherlock into the game. They were struggling to deal with players like Alan Dillon, Conor Mortimer, Kieran McDonald. They just couldn't get hold of them, and Mayo were just very crafty with the way they played. They were quick, they were intricate, and they were collecting their points with a lot of accuracy that Dublin weren't. And at half time, to Dublin's credit, they did manage to pull themselves back into the game. They were level at half time, I believe, or they were down by a point at half time. They kicked 1-5 in the first half, which clearly wasn't good enough by many ways for Dublin. But of course, then in the second half, you could see that Dublin, and this is where actually things got very embarrassing, in my opinion, for Dublin. I think had they have lost this game, under normal circumstances where they didn't blow a 7-point lead, you could say, well, you had an off day, these things happen. But Dublin clearly had the talent and ability there, because right at the start of the second half, you could see Paul Caffrey really laid into these Dublin players at half-time. Dublin came out with a vendetta in the second half. They were riled up, they were ready, and they actually kicked the same amount of scores that they'd kicked in the first half in about 15 minutes in the second half, and actually had a 7-point lead. I think in about the 55th minute, 56th, 57th minute, Dublin had a 7-point lead, and Mayo, they looked flustered. They couldn't deal with Dublin's fitness levels and momentum. But then what happened was very strange again, because Dublin just completely took their foot off the pedal, and this in many ways showed the naivety of that Dublin side at this time. Mayo got a bit of momentum, they start kicking easy points. Andy Moran got a goal, actually his first goal in the championship, and Mayo in the end seen off Dublin. And in fact, Dublin were just very tactically, they weren't prepared for this game. Stephen Cluxton kept hitting long kickouts in that second half. Dublin kept losing the midfield battle. What Dublin actually should have done is just retain possession, take the momentum out of what Mayo were doing, and then try and counteract that and build from there. And they actually weren't. And before we knew it, Dublin were behind by Mayo, and ended up losing this game. Everyone had built Dublin up as this machine that was going to steamroll Mayo, and I think in the end we've seen that Dublin's fitness levels were not quite there. In many ways they burnt themselves out in that opening 10 to 15 minutes of the second half, and Mayo actually showed that you can train smarter rather than train harder, and in the end that was what got the victory for Mayo. And then we fast forward 2 years later. Number 4 on my list is Dublin versus Tyrone in 2008. Again, I mean, Dublin, you'll see a common theme throughout this video, where Dublin were just overwhelmingly favourites, and I actually don't know why in many ways, because they were coming up against sides who had played in All-Ireland finals. In Tyrone's case, they had won 2 All-Irelands in the previous 5 years. They had star players like Brian Dooher, Peter Canavan. They had Sean Kavanagh, who was starting to come into his prime, and Dublin, don't get me wrong, had great players, but the fact that they were overwhelmingly favourites was very much a surprise. But going into this game, I do remember it quite well. I was on holiday at the time, and Tyrone had a very poor year. Like, they were knocked out in the early stages of the Ulster Championship. They scraped through the qualifiers. They were coming up against Dublin, who had won the Leinster Championship 4 years consistently, and Dublin were the favourites coming into this game, and you can kind of understand why. But again, Dublin just never got going in this game. First of all, I think Dublin, they didn't really trust their bench that much. Alan Brogan went off, Bernard Brogan came on, didn't really have much of an impact. He was still a young player at that time, hadn't really come into his prime. Dublin were very poor at tackling. They couldn't get near on Tyrone. Tyrone were able to kind of just cut through Dublin very easily. Dublin seemed to abandon the man mark at times as well, and seemed to just leave a lot of open spaces for Tyrone to exploit. And there was in many ways poor shooting from Dublin. Jason Sherlock missed a couple of early chances. And I think another word pointed out about this Dublin side, and we'll talk about it again when we speak about the 2009 match versus Kerry, is that Dublin they had a lot of players that were coming to the end of their time. You know, they had their All-Ireland run-ins in semi-finals in 2006 and 2007, and by now I think it was fair to say that this Dublin team had just ran out of ideas. Kieran Whelan was coming to the end of his time, Jason Sherlock, Shane Ryan, Paul Casey. A lot of these players unfortunately were heading towards retirement, and they just didn't quite have the energy to keep up with a side of the pace of Tyrone, who were making things look very easy at times. And they weren't closing Tyrone down. Tyrone were just able to pass the ball around very comfortably. Davy Hart's goal, for example, very comfortably finished, and in the end that just wrote Dublin off. And it was an embarrassing display in many ways. Enda McGinley was fantastic for Tyrone, but in the end Dublin losing by 12 points, conceding 3 goals. And yeah, it was a sad day for Dublin in many ways. I mean, it was a miserable day. The weather was awful, and you know, as I was saying before, I remember being on holiday and, you know, selling Gaelic football to all these English kids at the time and saying that, you know, Dublin were this team, this amazing team that were now ready to win an All-Ireland. I mean, why did we think that? I don't know. I remember building Dublin up, and then we all sat down and watched Dublin versus Tyrone, and yeah, it didn't end well. Let's cut it there. And next up on the list, we move 4 years previously, Dublin versus Westmeath in 2004. And yeah, this is another one that stings quite heavily, mostly because I have a lot of family connections from Westmeath, and you know, they still even talk to me about this game today. It's as if this was the only game in history that ever happened between Dublin and Westmeath. I mean, you know, Dublin have had some fairly good results against Westmeath since then, but yeah, back then in 2004, this was a massive surprise. I mean, don't get me wrong, Dublin were awful back then. I mean, I think they'd won like one Leinster title in a period of 8 or 9 years. They just kept on getting it wrong against low-level opposition, and Westmeath were a young side. You know, they had players like Desi Dolan, Gary Dolan, Paul Conway, and you know, they had Paddy O'Shea, for example, in management. And I think Dublin underestimated Westmeath massively. You know, if you look throughout the highlights of this game, you'll see that Dublin kept on kicking for points. There was clear opportunities to go for goals, and Dublin just didn't create those opportunities. And I think there was a clear naivety about Dublin back then, that because they were Dublin, they were just automatically better than a lot of the teams they were facing. And I think in 2004 it came back to bite them massively when they lost this game versus Westmeath. I think there was a lack of energy from Dublin in that game, lack of enthusiasm, couldn't get near Westmeath in many ways. It just didn't prepare adequately to beat a Westmeath side that went on to win the Leinster Championship, and at that time were better than Dublin. I mean, they had some very bright young players, and on the day they got it right, and Dublin didn't. And then we move on to the game that I suppose Kerry fans will remember very fondly. Their 17-point victory over Dublin in 2009. I think this is Dublin's worst ever defeat in terms of points margin in the championship, as far as I remember. This was an awful display by Dublin in many ways. I mean, they were just awful from start to finish. And again, I mean, a similar team to the Dublin versus Tyrone game. I was speaking a bit about that when I was saying that obviously Tyrone came into the game having had a poor championship up until that point, and Kerry were very much the same. Kerry were massively wrote off by everyone coming into this game, even their own fans. Kerry were beaten, of course, by Cork very comfortably in the Munster Championship earlier in the year. They'd scraped by teams like Sligo and Longford, and I think they beat Antrim unconvincingly as well. And, you know, Dublin had come through probably one of the best Leinster finals of all time, beating Kildare in 2009. But Dublin were just all over the place in this game from start to finish. I mean, first of all, Kerry bullied Dublin in this game massively, and not only did they bully Dublin, they just schooled them. They were able to kick the ball with so much ease. I've actually never seen a team play at Croke Park against Dublin and just look so comfortable. It didn't even look like Kerry got out of third gear. They were unbelievable in many ways, and obviously that early goal by Colm Cooper set the tone. I mean, in less than a minute. I mean, you could even see in that goal where Colm Cooper brushed off his marker, was left free and scored, and that in the early minutes just kind of really summed up how this game was going to go. Dublin couldn't get close to Kerry's star players, Darren O'Sullivan, Declan O'Sullivan, Tommy Walsh. Mark O'Shea had a very good game for Kerry as well. And of course, Colm Cooper, I mean, he'd been wrote off massively coming into this game as well. And, you know, Kerry had a vendetta probably against the media in many ways. I mean, they had been massively wrote off by everyone, and I think they wanted to prove that they still are the real deal. And what better way to do it coming up against a Dublin side that was just massively overrated at that time. The writing should have been on the wall when Dublin were hammered by Tyrone the year previously in the quarter-final as well. And they came up against Kerry in this game and just, yeah, they very poor tackling. Their kickouts were very poor. They brought Kieran Whelan on, I remember, in the first half. He made a bit of a difference, but again, Dublin just lacked any real tactical edge. And in fact, as soon as Kerry probably got that goal in the first minute, it was game over. Dublin's confidence went. They were missing easy chances, and they actually didn't even create that many chances in this game, which I think was the most worrying part from a Dublin point of view. And yeah, I mean, Dublin were 12 points down after 25 minutes. They couldn't keep up with Kerry's pace, and in the end went on to lose the game by 17 points. And yeah, I mean, very embarrassing display by Dublin in many ways. It's a result that still gets brought up quite a bit. Maybe not that much, obviously, because this was Kerry's last win against Dublin in the championship, and of course Dublin have gone on since then to really dominate the All-Ireland scene. But of course, I do remember back then, you know, being at that game. That was a painful one because Kerry just looked untouchable at that time, and Dublin just looked a million miles away. When going into that game, I think a lot of people felt that it was the other way around. So it was very strange, but yeah, Dublin were horrendous that day. And in fact, I mean, I'll talk about why I think the next game on the list is the most embarrassing game from a Dublin point of view. But I think a lot of people will look back at that game as the most hurtful game as a Dublin fan, and I would have to agree with that. It certainly was. And then of course for me, you have the most embarrassing display I've seen from a Dublin team from watching Dublin down the years, and that was against Meath in 2010 in the Leinster semi-final. And the reason why I say this was because against Kerry and Tyrone, you were coming up against All-Ireland winning teams. Even against Mayo, you were coming up against a very good side. This defeat, however, for me, not only were Dublin beaten by Meath, they were absolutely hammered. They conceded 5 goals, 4 in the second half. Dublin's full-back line was exploited to absolute pieces. And look, listen, Meath were a good side. They had some good players, Stephen Bray, Joe Sheridan. But I don't think, you know, when you look back at the 2010 championship, were they better than Dublin? Probably not. You know, they lost in an All-Ireland quarter-final. They scraped through against Louth in that controversial Leinster final. Dublin very much restructured after this game, and in many ways this was actually a game that probably allowed Dublin to really recognise that they needed to make a lot of changes if they were ever going to compete for an All-Ireland again. But yeah, looking back at this, I mean, Dublin just got it awfully wrong. I mean, first of all, they abandoned the man mark, and they just seemed to constantly press on, you know, what would happen was Meath would loft long balls into the likes of Joe Sheridan and Stephen Bray, and what would happen is 3, 4, 5 Dublin players would all press towards the ball. First of all, they weren't winning the ball, so Joe Sheridan would win it, he'd flick it on, and then all of a sudden Meath would be through one-on-one with Stephen Cluxton, and that just kept happening time and time again in the second half. And that was actually how they were allowed to score all them easy goals. Stephen Bray scoring a couple of goals, for example. I think Joe Sheridan got one as well. Dublin were just out of sight, and they couldn't counteract Meath's momentum. And a lot of Dublin's forwards were very poor in that game. Bernard Brogan had a decent game, but he was probably the only one. Dublin at times in midfield were overran. They just couldn't get to grips with Meath whatsoever. And Meath were allowed in many ways, as I said before, to comfortably dispatch a lot of those goals past Dublin. I actually think Stephen Cluxton probably had a bad game that day as well. A couple of those goals he probably could have done better on. Did he need to come out, I think, for, was it Meath's second goal? Did he need to come off his line like that? Probably not. But again, I don't think Dublin had any leaders in their full back line, and even in their half back line. They lacked any sort of real discipline in defence. Poor tackling, poor defensive positioning, and, you know, in the end, Meath comfortably beat Dublin very easily. And, you know, when you look back, that was in a Leinster semi-final when Dublin had been dominant in the Leinster Championship. They had been the side that, you know, everyone was talking about in the Leinster Championship. Let's not just forget that a year previously they beat Kildare in probably one of the best Leinster Championships of all time. And now they were playing Meath, who did have some good players. They had some talented players, But I think a lot of people felt that Dublin were better than Meath, but Meath on that day were miles and miles ahead, and in the end ended up winning this game by I think 13 points. Yeah, look, listen, fair play to Meath, but Dublin, for me, that was probably the worst display I've seen from Dublin, just in terms of they threw in the towel. They completely gave it up. As soon as Meath started scoring all those goals, Dublin just completely, they just didn't want to turn it around. And in many ways, it was similar to what we'd seen against Kerry and Tyrone, that Dublin, as soon as they were rattled in any way, they just completely lost any confidence and they were beaten before the game was even finished. Anyway guys, that is going to be the end of the video. If you have enjoyed this, yeah, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Let me know down in the comments below if you want to see more content like this in the future. And yeah lads, I hope you all have a good end to your week. Have a great day. And alright, my name is Aaron and I will catch you all soon. Goodbye.